Cadillac shocked the world and indeed the auto show circuit for sure in 1988 when it introduced the Voyage concept. By this point, Cadillacs had pretty distinctive proportions, and those proportions had been relatively constant over time, with some notable exceptions when Cadillac downsized to front-wheel drive cars in the early years before those front-wheel drive cars were given a bit more length and more traditional Cadillac proportions. More specifically, there were always the very vertical style tail lamps, the vertical style C-pillar, the relatively thin upper with the big lower, and let's say a more boxy architectural style of design in general for Cadillacs than other cars. You always had this prow on the hood, kind of where the center section was raised relative to the rest of the hood, the egg crate grille up front. And the Voyage really kind of took Cadillac design into a new direction and an exciting direction. Gone were the vertical tail lamps, for instance. The upper was this very light section with a lot of glass. You had skirted front and rear fenders. And also you had this beautiful new grille. So the Voyage was a new expression of Cadillac design, and there really weren't all that many Cadillacs that had a proportion like the Voyage or that look of the Voyage until the last of the big boy Cadillacs, we'll call it, was introduced for the 1993 model year, and that was the Fleetwood and the Fleetwood Brougham. Yes, in 1993, Cadillac finally decided that it was time to replace the extremely aged vehicle that was introduced in 1977 and ran all the way through 1992. It did have a styling refresh for the 1980 model year, but really after 1980, there weren't too many substantial refreshes to the design aside from some different grille treatments. The sheet metal was basically the same all the way from 1980 through 1992. And the car ended up selling well with, frankly, no advertising budget. It sold to traditional Cadillac buyers. Cadillac was really putting money behind what it felt were the new wave of vehicles like the front-wheel drive DeVilles that came out in 1985 and the Elante even that came out in 1987. Those were the new generation of Cadillac. Of course, there was also the Cimarron that Cadillac did put some advertising dollars behind when it was first introduced in 1982. But the Fleetwood Brougham kind of soldiered on, and it was called the Fleetwood Brougham during this time frame to distinguish it from the Fleetwood, which was a front-wheel drive model that was basically a dressed-up DeVille. So you got the Fleetwood Brougham, you got a very elegant, stately, rear-wheel drive, large, architecturally styled car all the way through the 1992 model year. So it must have been a tough decision to redo the Fleetwood for what would be its final generation, and Cadillac would start calling it again the Fleetwood. The Fleetwood Brougham would become a trim option on this particular vehicle. The Fleetwood name would be dropped from the DeVille series, let's say the tarted up front wheel drive DeVille, and now would become the base model of this new 121-inch wheelbase, 225-inch long rear-wheel drive behemoth. Now, despite the fact that the 1993 Fleetwood and Fleetwood Brougham had a more rounded shape than the predecessor, after all, it would be hard to have something that was even boxier than the 1992 Fleetwood, although the Lincolns kind of did that with the Lincoln Town Car. In any case, there were a number of styling cues that did transition from the Voyage over here. Namely, the grille is one element that's quite similar. The shape is a little bit different, and the texture is slightly different, but it's clearly similar to what was on the Voyage. And I think the car in general has a little bit of the Voyage in the styling, but it certainly has older school proportions with a lot longer rear overhangs, as well as the vertical style C-pillar. And that whole entire idea that the Voyage had this very glassy upper was clearly gone and replaced, in particular on the Fleetwood Brougham, by a padded vinyl top that came standard with that trim. Now, if we take a look at this side view, you'll see exactly what I mean with the profile, and that is, notice that very vertical style C-pillar. There is not a glassy upper. There's a pretty thin A-pillar. The B-pillar here is relatively chunky, though, as is the C-pillar. And clearly you have a significant amount of rear overhang. So the proportions are a little bit similar to the historic Cadillac vehicles, except the windshield rake is way steeper on this car, and that leads to less dash to axle than what you'd see on a typical Cadillac. And I have to say, something about this proportion isn't quite right. One of the things that the old Cadillacs used to do really well was have their rear wheel in line with the C-pillar and the angle of the C-pillar. And if you look at this, the rear wheel is actually kind of inboard of the C-pillar. It's further to the front. And to me and to my eye, you almost want to take that rear wheel and just move it backward probably 3 or 4 inches so that it gets in line with the C-pillar. And I think that was one of the faults of this particular design. And, the Cadillac designers tried to do a number of things with this. They tried to slim the look of the body side with this extremely wide lower rocker molding. Can't even call it a rocker molding. It goes halfway up the doors and halfway up the car, and you can see it reflects the ground. And that allows the car to look a little bit slimmer, but it has a very tall upper and a lot of glass area. The side glass is tall because the belt line is so low. Notice, as is typical for the time, the belt line is below the top of the fender and below the hood. So that kind of gives the car this pretty chunky upper. Again, it looks like you want the belt line to be raised a little bit and maybe the C-pillar to be slimmed a little bit. But the styling kind of is what it is. And as we rotate around to the rear three-quarter view, I think here you can really see that glassy upper, and it creates kind of an issue here as you come to the rear because the designers, I think, wanted to have a pinched backlight there to give it a more formal look. So the belt line is way below the top of the quarter panel, and that kind of creates a smaller glass area for the rear window. But it also leaves the rear quarter panel a little bit pudgy and doughy looking. Imagine if that, let's say, that rear trim, that reflective trim, weren't there. How big this rear quarter panel would look, particularly with that skirted rear wheel. And, it's not maybe the best angle for this car. But you obviously have the vertical tail lamps, the Cadillac signature, and you have the reverse lights there that are horizontal. This reminds me a little bit of how on the 76 Eldorado they had the tail lamps as primarily a horizontal element on the car. And you really don't have too much to speak of in terms of creases or sculpture on the body side. I think the designers were going for a look kind of similar to the Chrysler fuselage era cars, where it was just one continuous arc, if you will, on the body side. And the one thing that really breaks it up on this car, and I'm sure it was anathema to designers, was because this is a Fleetwood Brougham model, it came standard with the vinyl top. And to me, the vinyl top just doesn't look quite right, especially with the doors into roof design. So you have the vinyl top just terminates where the door starts, and it looks a little funny. I think this car would look better if it didn't have the doors into roof. The vinyl top could wrap a little bit more down the side. But for whatever reason, this car was engineered with that doors into roof look. And here you have the dead-on rear view. I think what's interesting about this is despite the car's overall width and size, it actually seems to look a little bit narrow to me in the dead-on rear view. And I think some of that is just the vertical style tail lamps and the lack of horizontal elements from a design standpoint, aside from the reverse lights, and just very simplistic styling. There's not much going on with the deck lid. There's not really too much sculpture on this car. It has a little bit of tumble home, but also not all that much. So it doesn't appear to have a great stance, but it does certainly have the Cadillac heritage, if you will, and a number of design cues of Cadillacs of yore. Now, turning to the inside, we have this enormous instrument panel that doesn't have any sort of driver-centric orientation to it, and that really doesn't have much of a theme either. It's just basically this long, flat panel. And look at that crash pad area in front of the passenger. It's just almost like this dead space. The glove box is underneath that. And there's not much for the passenger to look at aside from that very thin ribbon of fake wood atop the instrument panel. Now, the seating in these, particularly the Fleetwood Broughams, was relatively comfortable with lots of power adjustments and lumbar adjustments. But I would say in general, the interior materials of this particular Fleetwood, especially in contrast to the previous generation, they just weren't quite up to snuff. This was the era in which General Motors was going through various cost savings. Remember that GM lost the most money that it ever had in 1992, And a lot of the interiors of GM vehicles during this time frame and for several years thereafter were really just cheapened because GM had to make money again. And I think one of the victims of this was this particular interior for the Fleetwood, as well as the interior on the Roadmaster and the Caprice. None of those were really expensive interiors. The materials felt pretty plasticky to me, especially when you contrasted them, like I said, with the previous generation car. And here's one more view of the interior. As I said, the seats were pretty comfortable in these. Unfortunately, the rest of the interior was admittedly just a bit of a letdown with the overall materials and fit and finish not as great as prior year Cadillacs. Let's switch under hood. Now, this is where this particular vehicle gets exciting because it has an engine that is shared with the Chevrolet Corvette, the Camaro, the Firebird underhood, except this particular variant does have cast iron heads as opposed to aluminum heads. And that is the LT1 V8 that you see here that was introduced in the Fleetwood in the 1994 model year and would continue on through the end of the run in 1996. It made 260 horsepower, which, remember, this was a time when cars that were making over 200 to 250 horsepower were extremely powerful and viewed as such. And this actually endowed this Fleetwood with some pretty awesome tire smoking acceleration. I don't think I've ever seen a 0 to 60 test of the Fleetwoods with the LT1, but a Buick Roadmaster, effectively the same car with the LT1 when Car and Driver tested it, went 0 to 60 in 6.6 seconds. Now, the Fleetwood's a little bit heavier, so maybe it would be 7.5 seconds, 0 to 60, but still amazing power from the LT1 V8. The first year, the 1993, did not have the LT1. It had the carryover 5.7-liter V8 from the previous generation car that made 185 horsepower. So it was quite a jump. You got another 75 horsepower going from the 1993 variant to the 1994 to 1996 variant because on the latter you had the LT1. Now, the LT1 in general is pretty reliable and robust. It is, after all, the Chevrolet small block V8. They do have one Achilles heel, and that is the OptiSpark distributor, and its proximity to the water pump is also an issue. So one of the things that you tend to have to just budget for is the replacement of the OptiSpark distributor. And I would guess that that's probably an $800, $900 repair. So just plan on that if you're going to buy one of these Fleetwoods. Other than that, the engine is quite reliable. And I have to say that in addition to being reliable and having good performance, the LT1 powered vehicles actually got good fuel economy as well. If you drove these on the freeway, you'd get 25 plus miles per gallon. Another interesting little tidbit is that if you opted for the Fleetwood Brougham package as opposed to just a standard Fleetwood, you got, as I mentioned, some extra little creature comforts and features like that padded vinyl roof or rear seat vanity mirrors. But another thing that you got with the Fleetwood Brougham, which was curious, is a shorter rear end ratio. So you got a little bit better acceleration if you got the Brougham package versus something else. I will also point out that these cars were full body on frame and that they had, for the first time in a long time, a 7,000-pound towing capacity. That's right. You could, with the HD trailer towing package, which basically had the shorter rear end ratio, a heavy-duty 4L60 transmission, you could tow 7,000 pounds with your Fleetwood Brougham. So it kind of was an SUV of its time and very similar to what passenger cars were of yesteryear, where you could tow your boat behind them or a trailer or something else. And that's what you could do with this old school Fleetwood and Fleetwood Brougham. So what do you think the last of these behemoths, and which one do you like the best? Do you like the Caprice, the Roadmaster, the Fleetwood? They certainly had wagon variants of those as well, or the Olds Custom Cruiser wagon. There was no Oldsmobile sedan, but they did have a wagon just for the 1991 and 1992 model years. Thanks again for watching.